Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this NLA webinar. I'm Peter Murray, Curator-in-Chief at NLA, and I'll be moderating proceedings this morning. So today we're launching our latest NLA London Tall Buildings survey. This is our 8th annual report since 2014, when we started to provide this unique insight into the capital's tall buildings pipeline. So this year we review what COVID and to some extent Brexit meant for the pipeline. And it's a year that has certainly brought disruption across many areas of city life, and tall buildings obviously are no exception. So as you'll hear today, we've seen a decrease in the number of applications coming in, as well as starts in construction. And that's all to be expected. But the pipeline remains quite healthy, at 587 in total at the end of 2020, which is a slight increase of 7.9% on the previous year. We also reflect on how new policies introduced by the London Plan and central government will influence the pipeline over the coming years. We'll also be touching on new planning policies, construction and materials requirements, as well as stricter environmental performance measures. As always, our research would not have been possible without our programme champion and research partner, Knight Frank, as well as programme supporters Turner and Townsend and View City. So thank you very much to them for their support. And I'd also like to thank all our contributors who shared their insights with us, and the NLA expert panel on tall buildings, which is advising on the NLA year-round tall buildings programme. And then finally, thanks to Home Views, who have contributed a fascinating report with an insight into residents' views of actually living in tall buildings. So before we hear the main presentation, which is coming from Stuart Bailey, who's a partner and head of planning at Knight Frank, I'll just remind you that, of course, as usual in these things, there's a chance to ask your questions at the end. So please do put them into the Q&A section on your screen. And now I'd like to ask Stuart if he'd like to present the detail of this year's findings. Stuart.
Thank you, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Knight Frank is very pleased to be the partnering NLA with the data again this year and presenting the survey for the second year under the Knight Frank banner. So thank you for that kind introduction. And if we could just move on to the first slide, please. So the pipeline itself, as Peter mentioned there, has overall increased this year by 7.9% to 587 tall buildings within that pipeline. Just worth reminding everyone that we're counting tall buildings as 20 stories and above. And effectively, we monitor that pipeline through planning application to planning permission to under construction. And what you're seeing from the stats this year is that the volume of planning applications has dropped reasonably significantly to 27%. We're also seeing, conversely, we're seeing an increase in the volume of planning permissions being approved. That's actually gone up by nearly 14%. And then, perhaps no surprise, but construction activity has reduced by 45.5%. So that's the big sort of changes in the pipeline. We'll come on to that in a bit more detail in a second. We've also, with the data we've been using from Molior this year, we've been able to draw out some more detailed information about Section 106s as well. So we've kind of separated out planning permissions from those schemes that are awaiting signing of the Section 106 or were at the end of 2020. So there are 75 tall buildings still awaiting the signature on the Section 106 agreement, which often adds a little bit longer to the timeline to getting planning permission. If we can move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so we're just going to break that analysis down a little bit into the 4 different categories here. So looking at planning applications first. And what you can really see from this, if we look at the bar in 2020 in the pink chart, thank you, you can see that it has significantly dropped down from the highs of 2019 and 2018. But it is still the third highest year on record for tall buildings planning applications being submitted. So by no means a catastrophe in that regard. And I think what we've clearly seen here is, a slowing of activity around March, April, May time last year. But actually 75% of those planning applications were submitted in the last 6 months of 2020. So, a return to normal working almost, and certainly hats off to the local authorities for getting their virtual platforms up and running and allowing the process to continue. And I think that also reflects, as we move to the green bar chart on the right-hand side of your page, you can see that figure of 75 planning permissions granted during 2020 there is a peak. Effectively, we moved up from previous years, and that it does reflect the activity in preceding years and the applications coming through the pipeline in 2018, 2019. But I think as well, virtual planning committees have worked. Local authorities have adopted those, and things have kept moving. So I would say, on balance, the planning system has been working. Yes, perhaps some frustrations around timings and things like that, but in terms of the developers and planning authorities working together to negotiate these planning schemes, these tall buildings planning schemes through the process, that has certainly been working to date. If we move on to the next slide, please. And this is where it starts to look a little bit different, and you can certainly see the impacts of the pandemic and probably some of the Brexit implications still carrying through here. So again, the first bar chart on the left-hand side is the construction starts, and you can see a really significant drop-off from 2019 to 2020 there. And indeed, 2020 being the third lowest year since we've started recording this data for tall buildings. So delays, obviously, in things moving from planning to construction start, issues or uncertainty about being able to get onto site and moving those forward, and the kind of the ups and downs that the construction industry had during that. And again, that's also carried through into completions on the right-hand side. And whilst 2019 and 2020 don't look too significantly different on that chart, there's just a couple less completions, 35 completions in 2020. What we expected at the end of, if you remember last year's survey, was the number of completions to be actually around 50 or 60 in 2020. So it is a significant reduction in the number of schemes that have seen completion. And some of those, many of those schemes will be, they'll be well underway in terms of construction, but delays and issues there will probably push many of those into 2021 now. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just showing the average height of tall buildings within London on our pipeline, and you can see that dotted line cutting across the bar chart there is the 29-story level, which, consistent again with last year, it's the average height of a tall building in the pipeline. And what you can see on the left-hand side of that is those boroughs that are peaking above the dotted line. No surprise that the City of London is sort of up there leading the charge, really, with an average of 39 stories on average across their tall building schemes and pipeline. Tower Hamlets just under 35. No surprise again, probably Lambeth and Croydon there. Islington, perhaps some surprise that Redbridge is up there at an average of 30. I mean, smaller amount of pipeline within Redbridge. Would certainly assume the implications of tall building schemes coming forward in Ilford. Next slide, please. So we're now just looking at the dispersal of the pipeline around London, and what you can see again consistently, East London is the main focus for tall buildings. So a whopping 45% of the pipeline is focused on East London, 261 tall buildings. About 3/4 of that pipeline within East London is coming through the boroughs of Greenwich, Tower Hamlets and Newham, but certainly those other boroughs in that patch are contributing strongly to that pipeline as well. Central London kind of holding firm at 20%, 115 tall buildings, and then we look at the other carving up the other kind of regions effectively within London. So the north is 7% of the pipeline, south not dissimilar, 10%, west at 18%. And moving on to the next slide. So we're now just looking at this borough by borough in a little bit more detail. And this is the 25 boroughs that have tall buildings pipeline. There are 7 that currently don't or didn't have at the end of 2020, although I think Merton and Kingston have certainly received planning applications in the first few months of this year that will put them onto the pipeline next year. But what we're seeing generally, the blue bar is 2019, the red bar is 2020, and the majority of these boroughs have increased their pipeline, some marginally. There are a handful in there that are sort of have steadied out to say matching 2019 to 2020, but you're seeing this still continued growth within the pipeline. I suppose a couple just to pull out for interest. Third one in there, Brent. You know, relatively speaking, quite a significant increase in its pipeline from just over 20 to about 32 this year, which is quite interesting for Brent as an outer London borough. But really, no surprise again, Tower Hamlets significantly, significant increase on last year, and its pipeline shooting up to above 90 and ahead of most of the other boroughs. But Southwark in second place, and we'll be hearing from Colin later on the panel, reflecting on various elements of activity within the Southwark and Tall Buildings pipeline. Greenwich in third place, and Newham in fourth place there. Hammersmith and Fulham, which has been one of the sort of strong contenders consistently in next in line. So, the activity still strong across those boroughs. Probably no major surprises in that, but we'll come on to the inner London and outer London split in a second. Next slide, please. And here we are. So, consistent with the last 2 or 3 years, we are seeing a relative growth in tall buildings in outer London that is outstripping inner London. So an increase by almost 10% within outer London, up to 216 tall buildings in the pipeline for the outer London boroughs, and that's 37% of the pipeline overall. So quite a significant and continued increase there within outer London, and all sorts of reasons for that: land values, housing needs in those boroughs, availability of land probably more prevalent, and also pricing as well. I suspect is having an influence on that. Next slide, please. This is the last slide. I'll just leave it as a backdrop while I'm sort of summing up a few of these things, but this is the dispersal of tall buildings across London within the various categories, and we've overlaid that with opportunity areas and regeneration zones within London. And what you can clearly see here is the kind of clustering that has been happening, the historic clusters around Canary Wharf and the city, but also the kind of newer emerging clusters, places like Ilford and Stratford, and to the east and over to the west, we're seeing Southall, and we're seeing Old Oak certainly featuring within those clusters. Croydon still to the south, that little cluster to the south of London, but generally speaking, the clustering happening largely in line with town centres and with regeneration areas. I think just to comment, I think it'd be remiss of me not to comment on planning reforms and planning changes within this, and how we might see the picture developing for tall buildings going forward. I think the London plan changes this year in March, as the London plan has been issued following sort of 3 years of preparation. It's quite a significant change for tall buildings policy. Partly due to this intervention from the Secretary of State as late as December, which has resulted in the 6-storey threshold for tall buildings. So that's effectively the minimum height that will be classified as a tall building across London, and a whole host of policy requirements that need to be addressed in policy B9 of the plan in terms of how you design and how you justify tall buildings. So that's going to be quite interesting. in boroughs that have perhaps historically looked at lower heights as being tall, Richmond, for example, perhaps a bit of pressure to increase height in certain locations within some of those boroughs. But in other boroughs, there is still the flexibility to adopt a different threshold, a higher threshold than 6 stories. But the boroughs are going to have to do quite a lot of work to support this. A number of boroughs are probably ahead of the game with this already, but there are still many boroughs that will need to adapt policies that are very specific on where tall buildings can go and what height is appropriate. And they will require an evidence base to justify that, saying what the impact is on character, impact on heritage, and how the growth capacity of the borough is being met more widely, and why tall buildings are appropriate. You combine that with design guidance and design coding, and that's quite a lot of work for the boroughs to get in place. I do think as well that developers and landowners are going to have to work harder and work earlier in the process to engage with the boroughs to actually identify and try and get their sites allocated, and justify height as well, to help the boroughs get to a position where they are being required to allocate sites with not only height identified, but scale and massing, and potentially land uses within buildings as well. So a level of detail that perhaps developers certainly historically have been much more comfortable waiting to do that through the pre-app planning process and not a plan development stage. So on one hand, more transparency around tall buildings, but on the other hand, certainly more risk for developers to sort of be upfront and out there with their proposals. Questions of viability and everything else potentially coming forward in the discussions in those. So I do think that in the short term, we will see some slowing down as boroughs develop their plans, develop their policies to catch up with the London plan updates. But in the longer term, I do see a return to tall buildings, perhaps not as so many in the 20+ category, as the height threshold is obviously being set at 6 stories across London, but certainly in terms of meeting housing targets for London, which set at 52,000 per annum, but have never got anywhere near that target. Tall buildings are still going to be part of the process for addressing that housing need. And on the commercial side, I haven't really focused on that particularly today. It's not a significant change on commercial buildings. I think we've seen a 1% drop off to 11% of the pipeline being in commercial. But the lack of Grade A office space within London is still driving a lot of that commercial development. I know the City of London has been quite certainly busy. They've seen a lot of tall buildings schemes coming through the pipeline last year and indeed this year as well. So the demand for tall buildings for commercial occupancy, the drive for more space, that employees are looking for better quality of office accommodation and daylight and all those considerations, is probably going to have an influence on that. Again, tall buildings being part of the equation in the medium to long term. That's it from me for now. I'll be back as part of the panel to answer any questions that may arise on this, and look forward to hearing from you further.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Stuart. I hate to think the size of the pipeline next year if we take 6 stories as a tall building definition.
Yeah.
So now we're going to move to our panel. We've got a panel made of Colin Wilson, who's head of regeneration Old Kent Road, Natasha Freeman, who's a director at Turner and Townsend, Fred Pilbrow, senior partner, Pilbrow and Partners, and James Goldsmith, head of leasing at AXA IM Real Assets, that of course is responsible for leasing 22 Bishopsgate, currently the tallest building in the City of London. So let's start with Colin. And Colin, perhaps you can talk a little bit about the role of tall buildings addressing housing need and the impact that the last year has had on your plans at Old Kent Road, and perhaps in light of your thoughts about location of tall buildings, what the new London impact the new London plan might have on where tall buildings are going to be located and whether opportunity areas are still the focus of them, as I know you felt they would be in the past. You're muted, Colin.
Thanks, Peter. Good start. Yes, in terms of housing, as has been picked up by Stuart, I mean, there is still a tremendous demand and still a tremendous shortage of housing, particularly affordable housing. So in the Old Kent Road, as an example, there are 3,500 people currently on the housing waiting list within the Old Kent Road, which is only part of Southwark. That's quite an astonishing challenge to try and make. And of course, the other issue is we operate a model we almost take for granted, a cross-subsidy model, where private sale pays for affordable. And I think within that, that's one of the reasons tall buildings play a key part in enabling that cross-subsidy model to operate, because it can provide that private sale, the great views, the vibrant life, the city centre location, but it can fund really good quality social housing, which is otherwise really difficult for local authorities to provide, and for the GLA to provide, because of the nature of funding nationally. In terms of where tall buildings will go, as touched on also by Stuart, the Old Kent Road Area Action Plan, I think we've preempted national guidance by, and indeed the London Plan guidance, by providing more specificity about where tall buildings will be located in the Old Kent Road and how tall they will be, and also what kind of typologies they will be, a mix of use they will be in those buildings. And I think that's really important in order to deliver those tall buildings and that housing. We've also been chosen as a pilot study for the new model design codes. We're the only one in London, so we're going to be running that out on the Bricklayers Arms to kind of test that kind of draft new model design code. My own interpretation of it is it's relatively flexible. It is, I think, saying to local authorities, you know, you can take this and you can make it your own. It could have been a lot more didactic, but I think it's a good job it hasn't been. The role of tall buildings, I think, will they have a future? Absolutely. Has there been a slight pause in COVID in terms of delivery and build? Yes, that's noticeable, but I think that's already starting to pick up. So Berkeley Homes' first phase has started in the Old Kent Road. So that's a scheme for 1,400 homes in total over 3 phases, includes buildings of over 40 stories in height. So that's very encouraging for us. And I think the key thing is 15-minute city has been touched on, quality of the homes inside, but also the spaces outside. So our plan, also plans for other parts of Southwark, are intrinsically linked to better quality park spaces, cultural facilities, shopping, bars, all those things we've been missing over the last year, and they're absolutely essential. And perhaps just a final piece from me, we have so far 1 tall building complete in the Old Kent Road, Bermondsey Works, 19-storey building. And talking to the residents there, they really enjoy being there. So it reflects, you know, the feedback from your analysis, Stuart's analysis, that the people do really enjoy the tall buildings. They enjoy the views. That particular building is a tower and a tail type, and it has this very large terrace, which the residents really enjoy. And one of the things we've been really working with is particularly with our members in the Old Kent Road, is a family-friendly nature of high-density tall buildings. And we think that's possible with those accessible park spaces, linking to existing infrastructure, but also including play and communal spaces within tall buildings. And it's interesting on your analysis, people talk about community within tall buildings. Certainly anecdotally, in the Old Kent Road, both new tall buildings and actually old estates. The old estates with the towers are not full of people with mental health problems who are in despair. They're full of really robust characters who love where they live and have an intense pride in it. And actually they resent that kind of offhand dismissal of them as human beings. And I think that's why tall buildings will continue to play an absolutely essential role in keeping London, you know, the desirable, exciting place to live that it's evolved into over the last 30 years. Thanks.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Colin. And now, Natasha, one of the other big impacts is going to be the Building Safety Bill and the new CDM regulations on tall buildings. How do you see that affecting tall buildings as we go forward?
Right. Thank you. The Building Safety Bill captures the Grenfell workshop policies and outcomes from all of the investigation that happened after Grenfell. The Hackett report, Dame Judith Hackett report, captures all the failures because we're aiming for not having a reoccurrence of Grenfell. And that's a very, very powerful persuader for getting it right. So it's not just about building new buildings, it's about building environments and including, as Colin alluded to, mixed use developments and including communities. Now, the Building Safety Bill is going to use secondary legislation to implement what the HSE and the government want to see as positive outcomes for what's coming out of a way of working. We have to consider not just about where we build these buildings, but how we build them. And COVID forced us to look at new ways of working to start off with. CDM, construction design and management, is part of the secondary legislation that the Building Safety Bill refers to as way of implementing not just a different way of working, a new way of working, but a culture change. And with CDM, it's all about future-proofing design for not only what buildings can be, but changes of use for existing buildings to make sure that we don't have another Grenfell, particularly in building the buildings as tall as we're doing now. Now, the Tall Buildings Safety Bill is already showing an evolving use of space, and part of CDM is looking at the logistics of how we build. So we need to use this secondary legislation, which the Building Safety Bill is already alluding to help implement what the HSE want to see as a culture change for the way that we develop buildings going forward. So whilst they were looking at skills, knowledge, experience, and training before, they're looking at skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours, because all of the failures that came out of Grenfell, which is what the Building Safety Bill is trying to address in going through Parliament now, is to make sure that we change the way that we manage buildings, develop buildings, plan. And what we do at Turner & Townsend, we're very passionate about supporting a change in the already built environment. And it means delivering better outcomes for all of our clients, helping them to get into that space. And part of what we're doing at the moment is helping prepare clients for what we think that change will be. And it's likely that CDM is not only just going to cover how we plan, develop and build, but to maintain also the logistics of that happening. We're already in a built environment. We've got to consider what we're working around. So there are lots of changes coming through the Building Safety Bill, which will look at how we manage to do exactly what Stuart is alluding to, what's covered in the Tall Buildings survey as what we're seeing coming through. And there's a lot more of it planned. So we need to prepare for that. And then what Colin has referred to as needing to include the existing environment in what's coming in the new landscape.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. And now over to Fred Pilbrow. And Fred, tall buildings are often criticised for not being sustainable, and I know you're doing some interesting work in this area. So can you tell us about what innovation is emerging around designing new tall buildings that are sustainable?
Thanks, Peter. I mean, I think we're going to see a new generation of workplace buildings, if only because the offices got to be better to draw people back to work following the pandemic. I mean, we're doing a very interesting project in Colin's neck of the woods down next to London Bridge for Dutch developers, Edge Technologies. And Edge have been pioneers in both promoting better environmental performance, but also health and well-being in their projects. And they have a process of continuous improvement. They did, I think, for Deloitte, the first BREEAM Outstanding building. Edge Olympic in Amsterdam has gone further, and our project, which is their first in the UK, will be the best that they've done to date. So we're going to achieve BREEAM Outstanding, WELL Platinum, Wired Platinum, and that's a first in London for a multi-tenant tall building. Getting to those cutting edge levels of health and well-being and sustainability is a process of deep integration in design, and we've been privileged to work with fantastic structural engineers, AKT, and services engineers, Atelier 10, and really every decision has got to be looked at through the lens of those two objectives. I mean, to call out three things that I think are particularly interesting for the project in London Bridge, I think firstly, we've looked carefully at embodied energy. We have a post-tensioned concrete superstructure. That's the lowest embodied energy we can achieve for a building of 28 stories. And PT is great, but it isn't so flexible in terms of allowing for change and adaptation, which is a really important part of sustainability. So we're integrating structural timber in discrete soft spots that allow us to link adjacent floors. And that's been pioneering the work we've done on that, looking at how you integrate compartmentation on a 4-story basis with the flexibility within that overall envelope. Secondly, we're using Edge's own bespoke smart systems, and they're a long way down on the Internet of Things. So every light fitting has 8 sensors, and one of the things it's testing for is CO2 levels. And often buildings are associated with high levels of CO2. It leads to kind of people feeling sleepy and unfocused. So we're going to monitor that in real time, and if CO2 levels rise, we'll put in more fresh air. And we're delivering the air through the floor. We're very passionate believers in displacement. I think you're not mixing the air. It's quieter. It's more environmentally efficient. It allows us to expose the concrete soffit to passively cool the building. And so those things drive both good well-being and good sustainability outcomes. But I think the third strand that's interesting is actually social sustainability. And our building won't feel like a conventional office. The ground floor is public. It connects to a new park that we're making, and we want to draw our neighbours into the building. And the Dutch are rather keen on social inclusion, and they want to move away from a kind of defensible corporate model. So I hope it's going to be a good addition to London's stock of tall buildings.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Fred. It was interesting to watch a report this morning on BBC, which talked about this survey, and it showed a view of the City of London Eastern cluster, but it didn't include 22 Bishopsgate. And I thought, well, how out of date the BBC's filming is really, which obviously they have to keep up now with people like James who are changing the shape of the skyline. So James, can you tell me now, what's the appetite like for commercial towers now as we emerge from COVID-19?
Gosh, the BBC, we're a little bit publicity shy, Peter. But it's interesting, these panels, you always want to find something that's a little bit controversial and everything else. And actually everything I've heard, is just really nice. And I'm struggling to find something where I want to kind of disagree with someone right now. But Peter, getting back to your question, I mean, before getting on to demand for towers, I mean, just looking at office demand generally, we're just coming through this pandemic. I hope we're coming through this pandemic. If I think back a year ago, it pretty much fell off a cliff. We can try and paint a better picture, but that's reality. No one really knew what was happening. Corporates all about defensive balance sheets, cash preservations. People didn't know what the future of the office was going to really look like. And so decision making pretty much stopped, which was all understandable. It started coming back in autumn. We then went down to the lockdown. But definitely the last few weeks, we've seen a kind of recovery and activity. And one of the things I always like looking at is the Deloitte CFO survey. And sorry about this, Stuart. I think it's the best kind of bit of related property research. Because it's a great barometer in terms of how people are thinking. And they've just come out with their new one. And I've just made the notes this morning. Optimism amongst the CFOs, these are the people that hold the purse strings, right? Optimism is a record high. Defensive strategies now turning into expansionist strategies, because it's one thing going home and trying to defend your business. You're in our competitive environment. How do we take it forward? Brexit concerns are fading. And in all honesty, Brexit didn't really begin to compare with the impact of COVID over the last year. But the one I liked is 2/3 of them say the bulk of their workers are going to be back in the offices by September. And this isn't us saying it. This isn't an advertorial. That's an independent CFO survey. What we are noticing, and this is where I am going to disagree with Stuart, this whole density thing. I think we were saying, we might have fewer people, but they're going to need more space. I think what we're saying, and maybe Fred's got a view on this, is most occupiers now are saying, hang on, we need to use less space, but we need to use it more effectively, more intensely. And that's got to be a good thing for the environment. What's the point of, taking all this office space and occupying half of it, half of the time? It doesn't really make sense. So we're definitely seeing that ESG and well-being is just off the scale from where it was a year ago. And that has to be the right thing. Corporates have been making big commitments. We heard all of those at Davos, and that's got to relate to their workplace. And actually, that's got to relate and be proven to the talent, the people that they want to employ, because this war for talent, I never really like that term because it's sort of commoditizing people, but getting the best people, getting the best thinking, they want to be in the right spaces. And I guess all of that kind of means this flight to quality. I've seen you quote that, Peter. I think you put it in the forward in Stuart's research paper. I think that's anecdotal at the moment, but that's the common sense view, and that is what we're seeing, this kind of flight to quality. And on this whole thing, when people say, "Oh, what's the future of the workspace?" I always sort of quote Roy Amara. Roy was a professor of technology at Stanford in the 70s and 80s, and it's he that came out with a quote that we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term, but underestimate it in the long term. And I think it's exactly the same with this kind of working from home. We saw these dystopian images of yellow and black tape and perspex screens and people walking around with 2-meter sticks. Frankly, if that was going to be the future of the office, people are going to stay at home. And do you know what? We're not really seeing that. I think COVID concerns have sort of dissipated in terms of the health and safety, with the vaccinations and everything else. And I was just at lunch actually with Stuart Lipton in Broadgate Circle yesterday lunchtime. It was absolutely rammed. So people, I think, are getting comfortable with that. I really like what Colin was saying about coming on to towers. I really like what Colin was saying about the family environment and the community, because for us, the whole thing about going into a tower, forget whether it's a tower, whether it's a groundscape, but going into something of scale is about all about creating community. And when we had to make the decision to sign the big build contract on 22, it was just as Google were signing a contract to build their big headquarters in King's Cross. And Sundar Pichai, who's the CEO, he came out with this great quote about, if we want to, that's right, increasingly for the kind of complex things we need to do, we need to bring people together from different backgrounds, different experience to create IP and solve problems. And it's this thing about being in a social network. And then Matthew Syed, whose book I love about rebel thinking, power of diverse thinking, and he talked about how Route 128 in Boston, how these big companies like Wang and others, who were the big companies in the 70s and 80s, but working in silos, suddenly gave way to this kind of activity that was going on in California, kids in jeans and t-shirts, who were just small companies working, collaborating with each other. And they were the ones that were moving to market quicker. And I think that's why people want to get into environments. People want to, when people go into their work environment, they want to work in social networks. And, we're definitely seeing that come through. And this whole thing about using less space. So, within 22, 10% of the building were put across to shared spaces, eating, collaborative, gyms, well-being spaces, clubs, and all this sort of space. And so, so far, look, I guess the way to say, Peter, if we were redesigning this building now compared to where we were 5 years, I don't think we would have made much change. I'm not saying we've got it right. Time will tell. We're kind of over half let, and I think the next 6 months, 12 months is going to be really interesting to see how it manifests itself. But going back to something else that Fred said, if you're going to put up a tower, generally towers don't come down once they've gone up. So it's long life, loose fit.
Thank you very much, James. Yes, interesting that the CEO survey is optimistic. I mean, the IMF even yesterday reported that economies were expected to get back to relative normality by 2024, which is much quicker than everyone thought. Yeah. And I did an interview, which will be on our website later today, with Patrick Wong, who's just had planning permission for 2 new towers in the City of London. And he was saying that, yes, lots of people saying they're going to cut down on office space when people have got short-term bottom line problems. That's what people like to do, cut costs. Yeah. But in a couple of years' time, that will shift and change, and demand will return. He believes, and of course he would believe that, wouldn't he? As he's about to build 2 new towers. So anyway, we have got lots of questions now coming into the Q&A panel. So let's start. Simon Went, there's a couple here for I think for Stuart. Simon Went says, why is Bromley not on any charts? Is that because they're very low? And then Patrick asks, is the 6-story limit law or policy, and where can it be found? So Stuart, could you deal with those two?
Sorry, I take myself off mute. Yeah, in response to the first question, Bromley not currently on the pipeline. It's you know, the data that we have wouldn't have shown Bromley as having any schemes within the pipeline in 2020. That is obviously 20 stories and above. So some boroughs have complained in the past that they've got plenty of schemes at 14, 15 stories that don't feature on the pipeline, but we have to do the cut-off somewhere. So Bromley not currently featured amongst that pipeline. And the second question, Peter, just sorry, remind me the...
Is the 6-story limit law or policy, and where can it be found?
It's policy. It's in policy D9 of the New London Plan, and it's effectively the threshold height at which various requirements need to be assessed in terms of tall buildings.
Thank you very much. Natasha, did you raise your hand? Did you want to say something?
Sorry, just on the end of that second question, so I'm glad you did it in that order. The 6-story limit features in the Building Safety Bill.
True.
It's classified as a building in scope, and what the Building Safety Bill wants to do through implementation, through secondary legislation, is bringing in a whole new way of processing projects and buildings which are 6 stories and above. And that's what we're looking at with the secondary legislation, and it mentions CDM as one of those conduits for implementation. So we believe that that's what it's alluding to, and how the implementation will take place in the mechanics of how a project follows through from planning and development through to maintenance and what happens afterwards. So that's probably where that 6-story thing has come from as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Patrick also asks, and this is one for Colin, I think, I'm interested in density levels in the context of families. What is an acceptable density level? Because I think quite a lot of new towers tend to have smaller units, don't they, in 1 and 2 person occupation rather than large families. What are your views on that?
Yes, Peter, and I think one of the things that we're always very cognizant of is the mix of family size units within a tower. One of the things that we have been increasingly asking for and getting from developers is larger 3 beds and 4 beds. And then you can use the GLA guidance around predicted child yields, as it's called, to kind of roughly estimate how many children you're going to have in that building, but also if it's a plan-led process, as we are trying to do in Old Kent Road, kind of how that sits within a wider context. Certainly, one of the things we're trying to avoid is having a building with potentially 1,000 children in it with nowhere for them to go, because history would tend to indicate that when that's happened in the past, it doesn't have great outcomes. So it's kind of getting that balance right. But what you can do with tall buildings, particularly with podiums, and I mentioned the one that's already built in the Old Kent Road, is provide both indoor and outdoor play and communal space. The other thing that we're really, really keen to drive on is when we've been approving conditions, there is a bit of a tendency sometimes just to approve conditions for things like play space as an afterthought. Certainly my experience is lots of developers will usually get 3 pieces of play equipment in, which is a balance beam and another balance beam and possibly a boulder. And one of the reasons they make play equipment so boring is that nobody uses it, so the maintenance costs are very low. So what we've been encouraging people to do is to put water play in these spaces, to put sand pits on. I had a very long debate with a contractor team about having a sand pit on a roof. They said it would end up being a catastrophe to have a children's sand pit on a roof because it would block up all their drains. Eventually, we talked them around to this was quite a reasonable ask. So there are very practical things we can do to make those places child friendly. And it's not just about the play, it's about communal rooms as well. So a lot of the schemes that are coming forward have those things integrated into them. And they're really important. And I think they make people feel that, you know, they are valued being in that space. So picking up on James's points about how you feel about how you're treated as a human being when you're moving into these places. And it's interesting that on your survey, people do think that those sort of buildings generally are more well thought through in terms of design and consideration. And that's certainly what we're trying to do, to meet that kind of family-friendly piece. But to the question, I don't think there's an absolute answer in the terms of a density. It depends how many children you're likely to have in a place and getting that balance right. But you can work that out. You know, you can have a sensible conversation about that.
Thank you very much. Now, we've got a number of questions from June Barnes. I'll just pick one just to be fair to everybody else. And says, I'm not quite sure who would want to respond to this one, but there's evidence that service charges are rising and particularly high on taller buildings. Should more be done to inform new residents about likely long-term costs, and should information on service charges be included at planning stage as an issue to consider? Who would like to tackle that one?
Well, Peter, I'm not sure I'm going to give you the detail of the service charges, but I do think that one of the advantages of having the twin focus on both well-being and environmental sustainability is that actually we're reducing energy usage, and that must be a contributor to lower service charges. So on the Edge project I mentioned, we're targeting 25 kilowatt hours per square meter for our operational energy, and I think that feeds through to lower running costs. So hopefully it's a win-win. I suspect James would have some hard numbers.
Okay, you put me on the spot. No, we had, well, look, actually, something I will say, and going back to what Colin was saying, you know about the sand pit on the roof and everything else, is when you put up, and actually I'm going to quote Renzo Piano here, Fred, I think he said, look, when you put up, you know, if you're an author and you write a duff book, then it just goes and gets pulped. If you put up a tall building, you're imposing that view on anyone for generations to come. And because of the cost involved in it, I really see generally, you know, perhaps we're a little bit risk averse, and all credit to Edge, because I remember going over to Amsterdam and seeing Olympic and everything else, and, you know, absolute first-class developers. I'm really excited to see what you do there. And actually, well, that garden you're putting at the bottom of your building, perhaps you should put some more play area in there, Fred. I don't know. But, you know, perhaps, you know, we should think of buildings as being in permanent beta. We shouldn't say, right, that's it, job done, designed, I'm just now going to collect the rent. We should always be changing and challenging. Landlords should take more responsibility for creating, you know, humanity in the building and changing it, not saying that's what it is day one, I'm going to wait, you know, 15 years before I do change. Permanent beta is a really important thing, you know, for us. In terms of service charge, we had loads of debate on this, and, you know, the agents are saying, well, you've got to get, sorry, I'm talking commercially now, you've got to get it below £10 a square foot. And we said, well, why? We're not. We're going to be £12, £13 because we're doing all these facilities, all this thing, creating the right building. And actually, when you talk to the occupiers, they said, look, we don't care whether it's £10 or £15 a square foot. We just want to know we're getting really good value. We'd rather pay 15 and know it's been properly run and it's effective, rather than paying 10 and it's all a little bit shoddy, would be my kind of call on it. Obviously, you've got to do it effectively, efficiently. But, you know, this is the other thing that, you know, in the old days, commercially, property managers were there to keep everyone quiet and sort out problems. Now they have a completely different role, and they're the ones that are actually creating that city, a completely different role, you know, far more relevant to the long-term value, sustainability of a building.
I think definitely June's question is about residential.
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a partial response to that. I mean, the initial point is obviously the service charge consideration isn't just on tall buildings. It's on buildings of 5-6 stories as much as it is on tall buildings. However, you know, we've seen it come up. It's not really a planning consideration at the moment, but planning committees have asked about it, and it's something that's become more topical. I think there's a lot more of an eye on it and a sort of attention to it. So, you know, how that comes forward in future, I'm not sure. But I would just also point to this year we've had Home Views have inputted to our survey for the first time, and we've always struggled to try and get the sort of consumer satisfaction into the tall buildings report, particularly on residential. And what has been really interesting from the data that Home Views have pulled, so they've basically canvassed residents of tall and non-tall buildings across London. Thousands and thousands of responses to that, and interestingly, this tends to be more modern buildings. So we're not going back to the sort of 60s and 70s built buildings, but the ratings for the tall buildings have come in higher than the sort of mid-rise and lower-rise buildings, and particularly on things like facilities, design, location, value, management, quality of management. So it's been really interesting. You can see the details of it in the survey. I haven't got time to go into all of it just now, but tall buildings score higher generally, and tall buildings within clusters tend to score higher as well, interestingly.
Good. Now, as a quick question here from Peter Everston, which you might judge wanted, Stuart. Surely the permissions for a lot of the approved tall buildings will have expired. Presumably, you know, that we've been surveying this for some time, and there are clearly some which have been in the pipeline for some time. Are they dropping out as well because of that?
It's a really good question, and honestly, the facts don't point to that at the moment. But I think if there's a continued delay on construction starts, we'll start to see that materializing potentially in the next couple of years. Also worth bearing in mind that a lot of these permissions are outline permissions that have a longer trajectory in terms of delivery. So it's not a 3-year planning permission that a full planning application would be. So not a lot of evidence of that at the moment, but something to watch in future years.
Thanks. Then we have from Dickon Robinson. Anecdotally, we understand there's a large overhang of unsold high-rise apartments on the London market. Prices are said to be falling significantly. Can the panel confirm this? And if so, is it likely to undermine the viability of new projects? I think that's you again, Stuart. Do you have any Knight Frank figures on prices? You're still muted, Stuart.
Sorry, Peter, I just lost a bit of the connection there, I'm afraid.
Okay. You're back now?
Yeah, you might have to repeat the question for me, I'm afraid.
Right. Anecdotally, we understand that there is a large overhang of unsold high-rise apartments on the London market. Prices are said to be falling significantly. Can the panel confirm this? If so, is it likely to undermine the viability of new projects?
I think I don't have any hard evidence in front of me to respond directly to it. I mean, it's true to say that the prime market has been impacted probably harder, I think, in the last 12 months, and the sort of again, you've seen the outer London market kind of booming in that regard, and you know, whether that's a drive for more space and more greenery and more openness. Also the fact that certain elements of the sort of foreign investors probably certainly haven't been traveling as much recently may have a bearing on that. But I can see Colin's got his hand up, so he might have something to add to that.
Right, Colin, what have you got to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, again, sort of anecdotally, the elephant developments, it's still selling really well. You know, and I think this is a good example of, it's not a kind of super prime location, but it's central London. It's got fantastic landscaping and that kind of entire environment's kind of master plan piece. So it's not just about the tall buildings, but it's certainly sold really well. And the completed tall building in Old Kent Road sold out very well. And as I say, Barclay Homes are bringing forward their first phase. So they tell us they're very confident that that you know, that's marketable, sellable, and desirable.
Great, thanks. So Dickon, the answer looks like no. So now Janet Morris asks, do tall buildings like 22 Bishopgate really think retrofitting will be possible in an unknown future? 5 years ago, when the building started, retrofitting wasn't as high profile as it is now. So James, is the building long life, loose fit from that point of view? It can be retrofitted to suit changing circumstances?
It's quite right to ask that. And I said earlier, if we were redesigning the building now, what would we do? What would we do differently? And I think in a post-COVID environment, I don't think base builds have changed much. I think what is going to change a lot is people's fit out and how they use the space, and certainly less assigned space, more community spaces, you know, within people's fit out. Look, the best example I can give is when we designed a building. We designed it with 3 meter floor to ceiling heights, the average typically being 2.65 to 2.75. And Fred would back me up on this. In a building of 62 levels, that probably meant we had to forego 75 to 100,000 square foot of net lettable space. You put that into a kind of a spreadsheet, that is a big number, but that was the belief that we had in long life loose fit. So in terms of retrofitting, you know, extra floor to ceiling height makes a big difference when you go into the space and feel, you know, lots of light coming in. And the design of the floor plate, Karen Cook at PLP, you know, responsible for this. We did some work with Jack Prinkle and his colleagues. And instead of creating a square, we wanted to create lots of different depths, because for us, it's really important to get a diversity of different types of occupiers. But as tastes, needs, workplace trends change, you can adapt it. So I really hope and genuinely expect that, you know, retrofitting and changing it has to happen. And as I said, WSP came up with a piece of research. I was on a panel and I mentioned it, and they came out and said, actually, we can reinforce that. I can't remember how many genuine tower buildings have been demolished in central London, but I think it's not like one. You know, Draper's Gardens came down, and that was a heck of a thing, wasn't it? Tall buildings tend not to come down, so you have to be able to retrofit them.
Yeah, and very few in New York too, I think.
Yeah. Well, JP Morgan have just done it, haven't they? And it's quite a thing.
Yeah, and that one wasn't that old either, was it? So
yeah, quite.
Anyway, let's whiz through. So we only got 3 minutes left. So here, James Felsted says a more detailed plan-led process seems the right approach to me, in that it allows local authorities to shape their boroughs more strategically, but also make public engagement more tangible to the public. Old Kent Road is a great example. Does central government need to provide greater funding to local authorities to expand this approach more meaningfully? Well, I think that's obviously one for you then, Colin. A quick answer, please.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, good. Right, we'll go with that and pass it on to Robert Jenrick. So now this is Outer London Fights Back here. Richard Truscott of Haringey says, I find panel members' optimism at the return of the office unbelievable, though agreed demand for housing is robust. Suspect you're missing growing demand for higher density and therefore sometimes higher rise flexible workspace and new flexible live workspace, like the robust warehouse living trend we are seeing more and more in North London. So I think that's an interesting, I might say, comparison between what is happening in the CAS, because you're in the CAS now, Colin, aren't you, as well? So and Outer London, who's got a quick thought on that?
I think Peter, really, I completely agree that residential is going to change as much as workplace is going to change. Yeah. All I can say is on our Edge project, we've had plenty of interest in taking the space. So I'm pretty confident the office is coming back, and I think people need the connection. But equally, I wouldn't reject a change in residential design to facilitate home working. I think people will increasingly live and work flexibly, and some of the week they'll be working from home, and we've all found the pleasure of working. I'm looking at my son's bedroom in the background, the pleasure of working at home, not unalloyed, but it's got its upside. So I think residential will change. I think it's a good call.
And actually, if I can just jump, I completely agree. You know, we've all been obsessed over this last year about what does the future of the workplace look like? You know, what does the future of residential look like? Because space standards have, you know, been compromised for commercial reasons and everything else. And suddenly people having to spend more time at home. You know, I've got colleagues who are sort of perched on the edge of a kitchen table, you know, other colleagues that, you know, got kids bouncing around. You know, suddenly when that residential has to work a little bit harder and a little bit more flexibility, a lot of it has been found wanting. So I think it should be more focus perhaps on residential and commercial.
Fine. Well, one final question in our last minute. Andrew Wood says the argument that the taller buildings are required to deliver the 35% affordable housing target from the mayor. Has anybody done any analysis of what height is required to deliver that, given construction costs and general delivery costs? Is there any analysis, Stuart? Maybe that's something that you might know about.
Not specifically on viability, and you know, a question might be a lot of these schemes that are stacking up in the planning, the banked planning permissions that aren't yet coming forward. You know, is that because they've committed to affordable housing figures that are challenging in tandem with increasing build costs and other pressures? But again, you know, we haven't done that analysis, and it's probably something that could be looked at in future.
Yes, well, Colin's early points around cross-subsidy models and the benefits of tall buildings there is very interesting, but we haven't got time to go into that now as we are up to time. And I think, you know, long life, loose fit, and buildings is a jolly good thing. And the fact that tall buildings are going to last for 100 years or more leaves us with just a point from Peter Everson, who says, does that mean we're going to have to live with the wrongly placed walkie-talkie tower forever? So, you know, we should remember that tall buildings do actually have an impact on the wider environment, and it does tend to be long lasting. So thank you very much for your well, Stuart, for your presentation, and everyone else for your comments. Thank you to everyone for being here today. And just to remind you that we do, that the NLA Tall Buildings Report 2021 is available to download on our website, nla.london. And we're going to continue the discussion next week. We have a city dialogue with Chicago, of course, the capital of the skyscraper. So we're going to have a discussion with architects and urbanists over there to talk about tall buildings. And now you will see on your screen a little poll, and we'd be very grateful if you could fill that out, as it really helps us to make sure we're doing the right sort of thing in terms of program, the sort of things that people want to come and listen to. So thank you all very much indeed, and enjoy the report.